so much for joining us on the CRE Project podcast. Super amped to have you on for a couple different reasons. Obviously, you're ridiculously active in the commercial real estate field, but more importantly, I think you really are going to offer our audience kind of a different perspective on an often very daunting task within our industry, and that's really raising capital for real estate. And I think, again, what makes you kind of unique is the fact that you're not necessarily always the sponsor of a project. And I'd really, we've given some brief background, but we'd really like you to kind of give a really clear understanding of what you do and the uniqueness behind it and how you've really built a massive business off of raising capital in commercial real estate. So again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it. And, I think kind of like your intro explains, I looked at the real estate sector and I'm a huge proponent of focusing on your strengths. I love the raising capital side. I love interfacing with investors. I love not necessarily the sales component of that, but it's more of the transfer of the passion I have about this incredible asset class and the ability to really open up so much freedom. And I think that freedom in the world of real estate, I'm sure everyone on this podcast and everyone listening to this, that's the number one reason why they find real estate so compelling. But at the same time, I also like the fact that I'm amongst people that talk about freedom a lot because they can direct their own freedom. But the reality is they love what they do and they all work their butts off. So it's kind of interesting, right? I think all of us had this idea where I'm going to invest in real estate. Now I can only, work 20 hours a week and I can go to Mexico twice a month. And the reality is once you start seeing what this industry is capable of, it's like, I want to do this all day, every day, because the freedom is so compelling because you don't feel trapped, but at the same time, you don't feel trapped while you're working either. But yeah, to your point, I started a company around my strengths. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. And I had a knack early on in my career for identifying best-in-class operating partners, joint venturing with them, investing my own capital at first, and then bringing on immediate friends and family. And we went from, 5 investors to 10 to 100 to now we have hundreds of investors that have invested passively in our deals. So we can talk about all that today in this interview.
Yeah, no, that sounds fantastic. So what again, we really wanted to kind of dive into specifically with you is obviously you're a master at raising capital. Just kind of give us an overview. I mean, if we're starting out, what are the top things that one needs to do in order to raise capital in real estate?
Yeah. So, let's talk about the big one, right? So first of all, why is this even important, right? Before we jump into that, the reason this is important is that raising money is the single most sought after, lucrative skill in the entire real estate business. It's the one skill that if you can master it, you will never have a problem finding work in this entire massive industry.
Money's in the money.
That's right. It's very, very important that people recognize that. And it is really important that you not only be able to raise the money, but that the compensation structure is in such a way that you only make money when your investments perform. And that balances out that skill set. So you can either do both yourself, be the operator and be the capital partner, or you can find someone else that only wants to focus on those property-specific business implementation types of skills. But that's why people should pay attention to this interview. Because if you can't snap your fingers and make $5 million appear when you need it to, you can't participate in the real estate sector at all. Everything that you thought about how you could outcompete your competitors is just simply a theory. So that's the first thing. Now, the first actual tip I'd say about what you have to understand is that there's a massive myth in the real estate business, which is if you have a good deal, the money will appear. How many times have you heard that? And it's taught not only from people that don't know what they're doing, but it's also taught from people that do know what they're doing and have forgotten all the work that they've done to ensure that their deals get funded. And now they're trying to act like, well, it's easy for me whenever I put a deal out. Well, that person may have been successful the last 10 years with his investor base. And now for him, the money will appear. But you have to focus your efforts on ensuring that a deal never slips through your fingers because of lack of funding. And it's happened to almost every real estate investor that I know, including myself. I had a deal in 2014, mobile home park business that had nothing but tailwinds. cap rates in the tens. And I know that sounds a little ridiculous now, but trust me, I was operating the business and it was legitimate based on trailing 12 financials, a 10 cap, meaning if you buy the property in cash, you're getting a 10% cash on cash return if you basically do nothing. But I didn't have an investor base of people who are interested in those sorts of investments. So it didn't matter how good the deal was. I wasn't going to convince them to invest in the mobile home park business of all things without doing some of the things I'm going to line out today. So that's the first one. Don't believe the biggest myth in the entire real estate sector. It's the one myth that can ensure that you don't get to participate at all because it's so wrong. So I'll let you guys comment on that, but that's number one rule.
So yeah, and thanks for giving us a moment to comment because I do have a question. So what are you recommending? I think the best way to move forward in that circumstance would be to have a sample deal package where you're going out, and if you're having these one-on-one meetings with investors or you're doing luncheons, that you can say, this is not a real deal, but this is similar to a deal that we've done in the past, or this is one of my operating partners deals. This is what it will look like. And then I may be getting a little ahead of us here, but you have a fund per se, so it's not necessarily asset specific, but how do you address that? Does that money just sit with the investor until the time you call it due?
Yeah, really great question. I'll actually link a podcast that I did explaining our fund mechanics because it's very interesting. It's super technical, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about that, not because I can't do it, just because it'll kind of go down the legal jargon path really, really far. But in short, no, we do not accept investor capital into a fund unless we have properties that are under contract and set to close. Everything I do from the time that I wake up to the time I go to sleep, I try to be as aligned with investors as possible. And the reason for that is that I've learned that it doesn't matter how ethical someone is, if you're depending on their ethical behavior as opposed to the incentive alignment structure, eventually they're going to do things within their own incentive structure. And this is especially important in real estate where you have time horizons of 5 and 7 and 10 years. So we've all seen personalities change over that time horizon. And generally speaking, depending on what risk profile you're in, half of the return profile will be generated when the property is sold. So I need those personalities to be intact. And I've realized I can't control the personality. What I can do is control the incentive structure. But yeah, to answer your question about kind of pre-funding these deals, that's a great strategy. I would say just understanding that the business of raising money is much harder than most people contemplate. And so just sending out that initial email, that's not the time to start the conversation. The time to start the conversation is 6 months before you have your first deal under contract. And there's so many things you can do to make those conversations go a lot easier. I think, number one, reversing the flow mentally of how money comes to you. It isn't about, you mentioned some one-on-one lunches, for example, which I don't do a lot of in-person meetings just because of the lack of scalability with that strategy. But that's a perfect example of how most people think raising money works. They envision themselves in the middle of the circle, like all of us do, because we're at the center. And then we're going to go out to our rich uncle. We're going to go out to our friend that has 3 McDonald's and say, if you give me $25,000 to me, the center of the circle, I'm going to invest in a great deal, or I'm going to invest your capital in a great deal, and you'll get some money back. That is very, very challenging because you're going around chasing potential investors around. I don't ever want to do that, nor do I have the time to do that, nor is it actually economically viable to do that because it's a very challenging conversation to have. What I want to do is build an infrastructure so that the capital is attracted to me, so that I'm in a position to vet investors just like they want to vet me. And, I went from thinking about it like that, I went from failing to be able to raise $500,000 to be receiving emails saying, I would like to invest $250,000, just one investor,
from people you haven't even met before.
Correct. And now the argument could be, well, wow, that investor must be really stupid if they're going to give you $250,000 over the internet. But the reality is nothing could be further from the truth, because a huge time that I spend professionally is allowing that person incredible insights into everything about my business, my perspective on investing, my worldview, and unique things about my personality, so that at a certain point, they know me better than some of my closest friends, especially when it comes to certain topics. So by the time they send that email, they've done research, and I put them in a position to be incredibly empowered and educated. And I've got tremendous examples of this. And I'm not saying this because it's me. I'm saying that you can do this too. You can put your effort towards building that infrastructure so that the capital is attracted to you. And, that's a really important thing. I think the strategy and the structure of this particular interview that I want to make clear is that the myth is number one. The number two is you want to attract the capital. Number three, you want to nurture the investors. You want to educate the investors, and then you can close the investors. And those are the things I want to talk about today. And that first one is the attraction phase. How can I build an infrastructure, provide some sort of lead generation magnet, such as an ebook, that's going to be a way for them to, provide their email address, and now they're a lead, right? So that lead was attracted to me as opposed to me going around saying, hey, why don't you buy this ebook? I'm saying, here's this ebook. All you got to do, give me your email address. Now you're in the top of the funnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had mentioned mindset. I love talking about mindset. I think it's a key factor in successful people. And how much of this is mindset for you as far as changing that internal dialogue and self-talk that I am bringing something of value? I am not, you never want to look desperate or needy. You want to be coming from a position of power, right? And you have the value in the form of the deal. There's so much money out there right now looking for yield, and a lot of the value is in the good deals, and you bring that to the table. So do you teach that in your mentorship classes? Is that something that you had to change personally as you were getting involved with this?
Look, man, everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, right? Like I mentioned. So it's just a reality of the situation. For me, when I failed miserably at my first capital raise, it was not the financial implications. I'm a passive investor. I'm able to pay off my expenses with my passive investments. It was not my life is over. It was that I was embarrassed. It was that I had told friends, this is going to be my first fund, and I'm going to be raising multiple funds per year. I anticipate this first fund will be a $2 million fund, and it was a $0 fund. So that alone almost wiped me out.
Yeah.
And I don't mean financially. It was emotionally. I was thinking, am I going to have to go get a job somewhere else? Should I even be in the real estate sector? Like, are people going to trust me with $50,000 or $100,000? And so it's a huge part of the space, and anything regarding entrepreneurship is being able to weather those highs and lows. This is why, being an entrepreneur is so interesting, is because it's like a roller coaster ride. I'm sure all of you listening to this that have any kind of entrepreneur spirit, it could be your full-time job, it could be a side hustle, where you go from coming up with a new idea, thinking you're about 3 months away to IPO, then starting to implement it, realizing it's way harder than you thought it was going to be, and then you realize it's pretty much impossible, which is why no one's done it before, and then you sink to the bottom, and you're like, I'm going to quit. That's like 3 hours of every entrepreneur's day. So you have to be able to overcome those. So yeah, mindset's a really important part of it. And conducting yourself on the call, which we'll talk about during the close section, in such a manner that you're going into the conversation where you have what everyone wants. Lucrative, risk-adjusted, favorable real estate investments that the globe is constantly looking for. When you get started, it can feel like every $25,000 can make or break your entire world. To a certain extent, it can. But overcoming that and realizing that if you continue to put forth the effort, not of finding great deals, which are 100% a requirement, but putting forth the effort to attract the capital, then the money and the cash register will start to ring.
So Hunter, really quick, before you pivot to your next point, starting out, obviously, there's a certain level of trust that comes into play when you're exchanging money. What has been your key success when, again, if you're a guy starting out, you got a good project that you're looking at, you need funds, what's been your most successful strategy as far as defining and establishing trust with your investors?
Great question. And this is actually going to be different for each people. I mean, number one, you have to be honest and authentic. You have to be yourself, because in these long form 45-minute conversations, I can act like I'm someone I'm not for maybe 15 minutes, but especially if you have your own show, people are going to find out who you really are. So, in the beginning of my kind of public real estate persona, I was really cautious about talking about some unpopular beliefs I have, for lack of a better term. And when it comes to pretty much every important topic, whether it be schooling or, the Federal Reserve or the political environment, I'm like wildly unpopular on everything to the point where almost no one agrees with me. That's on a percentage basis. Now, what I've learned is that I don't care about the percentages. What I want is really high buy-in clients. So the more that I'm honest and authentic about myself, now all of a sudden I have clients that agree with me, and it doesn't take that many. We're programmed to want a little bit of buy-in from everyone, because from a tribal standpoint, if the people that control the food don't like you, you don't get to live. That is not the way that the modern economy works. The way that the modern economy works is that I don't have access to only 30 people. I have access to billions of people. And if I come and say the Federal Reserve is a scam designed to make the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and I understand that, and I'm going to intelligently participate in that space, there's someone listening to this that agrees with me. Mm-hmm. And they're going to reach out with me and go, well said. And that's cool.
The Federal Reserve is not federal?
Right. It just is one example of many that I can give where people go, okay, he's on that team. Got it. Me too. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's all of our investors are necessarily like obsessed with the Federal Reserve, but it's like, if I have 100 conversations that are an hour long, I can't just hide that for the rest of my life. I'm going to be open and honest about it.
Yeah. I think we live in such a good time to execute on this type of stuff where you can build a platform. You can build credibility, without ever even meeting someone, because to your point, they can listen to your podcast, they can read articles that you've written, they can really build a relationship with you and understand your position before even really engaging with you, person to person. So it's interesting.
Right.
Shall we jump on into point number 2 here?
Yeah, so that was attract. Okay. So the number 1 was the myth, number 2 is attract, number 3 is nurture. So think about it like this. I write an ebook, let's say that's 10,000 words. This is the attract phase, right? I write an ebook, it's 10,000 words. I get to a level of detail, which is like, not only here are the 3 bullet points, it's like, these are paragraphs, data, I'm using charts, I'm using analytical side of the conversation to really add some real value and to provide a clear thought process into our investment thesis as a company, whether that be about a specific asset class or just, let's say, passive investing in general, something that investors can really sink their teeth into. Then once they've kind of exchanged that email address in exchange for that ebook, we enter the nurture phase. And this is multi-tiered approaches, because each person receives information differently. So I want to cater to each of them, right? I want to be able to provide podcasts, which are for people that learn auditorily. I want to provide weekly newsletters for people that just want to read. And weekly newsletters, let's say somewhere between 300 and 500 words. And the way that I talk about it in the book, at least, is if you're trying to figure out ways to write articles, I would basically block 90 minutes to 180 minutes and just stream of conscious write every little topic that's interesting about your business. And I would make a goal to make 100 topics. And the reason I say 100 is that speed of execution is one of the most important things in business. If you can move faster and more accurately at the same time than your competitors, you can win. And even if you can't act faster than them and you can just go, you can typically win. So anything that overcomes procrastination is something I'm a proponent of. And when you know that you need to write 100, you don't think that every single one needs to be great. So once I have that list of 100, I want to find, let's say, 52 that make for compelling outgoing newsletters and write 1 for every single week. And then you'll have an email drip campaign that'll send out a newsletter once a week for a year. And by the end of that year, likely more ideas will come to you and you continue to expand on that. And the same investors are going to receive new newsletters for forever. And simultaneously, so I have podcasts going that are once a week. I do a Monday Minutes episode, which is usually 10 minutes. That's just me talking. And then, we have quarterly updates for our investors that are about the specifics of the investments. We have an annual conference. Right. So I'm hitting people on multiple different sensory inputs. They fly to Los Angeles, go to our conference, which is the Intelligent Investors Real Estate Conference. They get to meet me in person. They get weekly, quarterly, monthly updates. And overall, that relationship is developed, but it's very scalable. because I'm not calling each one of them to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing in the marketplace. Here's what's interesting. Here's what's compelling about passive investments. I'm creating a system so that hundreds and thousands of people can enjoy those resources all at the same time. And as a bonus, we recently launched an Instagram, which if you're interested, I know a lot of people don't use Instagram, but if you're interested, Hunter L. Thompson _, you can watch what I'm doing. I can take all this content in an article, all this content in my book, and make a little quote with a picture of me, and I'll make 100 of them all one day, make 100 little quotes with pictures of me working with a graphic designer, and then for 100 days, we'll post one a day. Now, I don't almost ever log into my professional Instagram account. It's automatically posting every day at 11 a.m., and this is the way that I try to think about business. I don't want to waste time. I want to create hyper-scalable systems.
Yeah, automated programs, which is
correct.
Amazing in today's day. And this may be an interesting question that you've never been asked, maybe you have, but what is your personal cost per investor? Have you quantified that by doing all of this?
Well, good question. Really hard to do. It's hard to do because there's so much time spent doing things that are free. Mm-hmm. And my time is my most valuable resource. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you don't feel that, I totally get that. I was there. As entrepreneurs, we've all been there, where you hear guys like Tim Ferriss going, time is the most valuable resource. Time, and you're like, dude, you should see my schedule. Trust me, time is not my most valuable resource. Like $8 is more valuable than my time. And I get that. So if you're at that stage of your career, the goal is to fill up that calculator. And what that means is output only. Don't worry about systems. Don't worry about automated posts on Instagram. What you need to be doing is just going as fast as you can in every direction that makes sense. Then you'll find yourself starting to have to say no and no more frequently. And that's when you know that you're starting to understand. And now at this point, I had someone come on my show recently and say, hey, look, I saw you weren't using LinkedIn in the way that's most optimal. Here's what you should do. All it's going to take is 15 minutes a day. And I was like, dude, that's not easy to come by. Yeah. Like, I don't I'm sure that people are listening to this can relate to that. Like 15 minutes a day is not easy to come by when it's cognitively demanding in particular. So don't be overwhelmed if that's not where you are quite yet. You will get there. Just the goal should be fill up that calendar.
Well, and I guess that the positive point that I'd like to make is, a lot of this stuff that you're doing, and that, a lot of people that are trying to raise capital, again, building credibility to invest a large investor pool, it's not hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's, to your point, it's more of a time commitment, which again, you're going to get a good return on. It's just such a useful tool. So that was the point, I was really trying to make there. So
let me make a comment about that, because investors should always be looking things on a risk-adjusted basis. If someone says I got a deal that's a 30% return, you're obviously going to see clearly, the first question you're going to be is, what are the risks, right? That's the whole point. Like a 30% return, that's not even consequential. That number means nothing without looking at the risk. As the same with a 2% return. So on a risk-adjusted basis, there are very few things that are more favorable than doing things like putting efforts towards writing an ebook. That one in particular I love, because your own understanding of your own perspective on the matter will drastically increase just through the opportunity of writing the book out, so that the next time you talk to a person about the topic, you'll find that the likelihood that they'll find what you're saying is compelling much higher. Another example is conducting a podcast or being interviewed on a podcast. If I found out tomorrow that I had made a mistake with the way that I connected my podcast to iTunes, and that none of my podcasts has ever been actually publicly available, it would still be wildly favorable for me, just because of the knowledge that I learned from being able to reach out to high profile people. So that's like not even including the business dynamic, just knowing about how to be a better investor. So again, looking at things on a risk adjusted basis, very good way to spend your time.
Would like to ask you now or later in the show, I am just curious, the benchmarks that you're looking at for your investments and what you are targeting for your investor returns at this point. I know it's probably changing day by day here, but have you been looking at, like an 8% return with or an 8%, cash on cash with a 14 to 15% IRR? Is that, conservative enough, or what are you targeting right now?
Yeah, so it depends on the strategy, to be honest. I mean, from a net perspective, typically we're not going to be super into it unless we believe that it's reasonable that the project will return low to mid-teens net to the investors.
Okay.
And that's pretty much in any stage of the economic cycle.
Okay.
The reason for that is we need to feel on a gross dollars perspective that it's worth our time to put it out. So if that isn't achievable, we're not going to participate in the space. And that's totally understandable. Now, in all fairness, we were underwriting to those metrics back in 2012 in the sense that we were looking at deals and saying, I think it's very reasonable to assume that cap rates will stay the same or even increase, and we're going to receive a 13% return. Now, a lot of those turned into 28% returns, but we're not then changing the dynamic to think that we're going to repeat that going forward. In fact, looking at the state of cap rates and the state of interest rates, it's basically impossible to project that the next 10 years are going to look like the last 10 years. We still think it's possible to achieve low to mid-teens. So that's what we're looking for.
Okay, you got it.
Number 4?
Yeah, let's jump on in.
Moving on.
Cool. So educate is kind of a more involved version of nurture. I think that a lot of people make the mistake of doing a ton, webinars are just so compelling and so scalable. It's just incredible. So if you have taken the time to put together an offering, you know more about that offering than pretty much everyone. It's a very simple tool. It probably cost you $2,000 to convert that, what I call an executive summary, some people call a deck or whatever, into a automated and visually stimulating webinar presentation. One little key takeaway with the webinar presentations is that I really like to make each bullet point automated individually so that each time I turn the page, investors, as they're watching it, will be focused on the words I'm saying as opposed to reading ahead. And you can go on a website called upwork.com, upwork.com. When it comes to graphic design, which is absolutely critical, I would usually spend somewhere between $20 and $35 an hour on international.
To build that pitch book?
Exactly. And it's basically just converting your offering deck into a presentation. You record the presentation either on Zoom or on QuickTime, and then upload it to YouTube, and then you can send it out to your investor base. This should answer 90% of the questions that investors have, especially when you have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. That will reduce the amount of phone calls you have to have drastically. And if your goal is to encourage people jump on a phone, especially if you're beginning this stage and you feel like they're going to need a little bit extra push, that's totally understandable. For people that have developed that relationship already, the goal is not to have a bunch of phone calls. The goal is to get the capital across the finish line once they are educated on the topic. And I cannot stress how important that is. The goal is not simply to get the $5 million into the bank account. The $5 million needs to be owned by investors that are significantly aware of all the risks, the time horizon, which is something that people fail to do appropriately, and the anticipated outcome in terms of the reporting and how things are going to go from here. Now, if that $5 million is owned by people that are educated, then that's really what the goal is. And a webinar is a great way to get that across the finish line without taking a bunch of one-on-one calls.
So Hunter, really quick, I got a question on that. What are the top qualifying questions that investors typically ask you, and what are the top questions that you typically ask investors?
Good question.
Yeah. I'd say that something that people will frequently get is basically, why should I invest passively when I can do this by myself? Especially if you're dealing with investors that have had some experience in real estate. If they've bought a single family house for $100,000 in 2008 and sold it for $300,000 in 2015, well, they didn't have to share the proceeds of that with anybody. So why should they, not just do that again? And so there's a lot of ways to address this, but what I'm not going to do is try to convince them that's a better route. What I'm going to do is just lay out the facts of the situation. And if they're okay with the big point of giving up control for diversification, they'll see that the passive approach is very wise to incorporate in your portfolio, even if it's something that you do on the side. Like, you could be a full-time real estate operator and still have a significant amount of your portfolio invested passively. So here's what I'll say. Look, I am a real estate professional. I have access to every deal that is available. Broadly speaking, I have access to some of the most favorable deals in the United States. But I have found that if I can identify best-in-class operators that bring a tremendous amount of value to the table, I would much rather joint venture with them, defer to their expertise, have them incur so much risk, especially property-specific risk. It's really important to annotate in this conversation that there's a delineation between passive investors and active investors when it comes to liability. So if someone is injured on a property, for example, I could not find any case law where the passive investors are held liable for that because they don't have oversight. They don't have control of that asset. They're not the ones that decided not to redo the roof, which could have caused that. So if you can look at real estate and say this whole liability of ownership is basically removed from the equation, and in exchange for that, you're giving up 30% of the proceeds of the deal, that is really compelling. Without even getting into the time commitment or how much expertise this other person has versus you, I'm happy to do that. Then, in terms of the expertise, the more complicated the asset class, the more relationships and algorithmic softwares matter, which we both use, obviously, the more someone can bring to the table. So if you're buying a $50 million apartment complex, it's very different than, I'm buying a single family house, and then this other guy that really knows what he's doing is buying a single family house, because the complexities of the investment are limited. It's a simplistic investment. Now, a lot of people have made money doing that, but when you look at the difference between a mom and pop owner of 200 unit apartment complex and someone who's owned 50, the delta is huge on the one that owns 50. So I can defer to their expertise. They can make up for it by bringing a lot to the table.
And I'm just curious on that transfer of liability. How do you deal with that mentally? Because that's passive. How do you quantify and come to reason with deals?
Man, that's a really good question. So we've done a lot of different structures. In part, we have done co-GP structures, and we're always cautious about insurance and using limited liability structures in an appropriate manner and not piercing the corporate veil. But as a passive investor, I know that I am not going to get a call. And hopefully, if an attorney is listening to this, I should say, contact your attorney. This is just my perspective. It's not legal advice. But on the advice of my attorney, I know as a passive investor, I'm not randomly going to get a call that says someone was attacked by a dog on your property that you invested $25,000 passively in. You're going to have to give up not only $25,000, but additional $50,000 more. That can happen if something goes really wrong, especially if there is some fraud or something like that, if you're on the GP side. So, my goal as an investor generally is to be able to sleep at night, and that removes that particular phone call in terms of the potential outcomes.
Can I ask you, Hunter, I understand that you cannot get paid directly for raising capital and bringing it to another sponsor's deal. So you have to be actively involved in that structure organization somehow. Do you become part of that GP? Is that what you guys are doing? Is that the easiest way that you have seen to work through that?
Yeah, good question. And Mauricio Rold, I should say, has done a lot of good work on this topic because there's so many misconceptions about this topic. And I'll say that entering the world of securities, if you're pooling investors together, there's a test to decide what a security is. From a big picture perspective, if you're pooling investors together that don't have direct control over the deal and they're depending on someone else for profit, it's most likely a security. So we work in the world of securities. So to a large degree, when we co-GP with an operating partner, it's because we're a fully integrated partner of the firm. We're not simply saying, here's $3 million, give us a 3% finder's fee, and we'll be on our way. We're basically saying, look, we have extensive experience starting before we even get into the deal. We have extensive experience with things like deal structure. Because of how we're positioned in the marketplace, I have seen more deals and more structures than pretty much anyone, because most people only do their own structure. right? So it's only self-storage, only in Florida, only with their own structure. So we've formed multiple funds with different structures where we call capital different ways. How do you want to do that? So we have extensive conversations where we're consulting them on this particular thing, which means before we even get started, that's a huge part of the partnership. Another part is that we're responsible for all investor relations. We issued the distributions, we issued the tax documents, we actually create the quarterly reports and stuff. So all of that is just additional things we're bringing to the partnership. And that makes it clear that we're not just simply bringing money in exchange for a piece of the general.
Sure. Okay.
There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'd say that if you're starting out and let's say you just want to bring your first $500,000 in, the way that you could do it is rather than be a partner, I would invest or create an entity that's sole purpose is to invest in another entity. And rather than have the general partner pay you, you could derive all of your compensation at the investing entity level, the one that you create. That way you're not violating a broker-dealer law because you're not being paid by a third party. Your investing entity that you're the issuer of is actually paying you, let's say, an asset management fee, or you get 10% of the return, for example. Those are a couple of ways. And again, check with your attorney. All these structures have strengths and weaknesses.
And Hunter, really quick, can you just speak really quick before you move on to your fifth and final point? What do you look for in an operator typically? And I know that's probably a meaty question, meaty answer, but just
I'll keep it brief. Everything in this conversation up at this point has been focused on scalability. This portion of the business is the opposite. We don't have any systems in place to attract sponsors. Everything that I do in terms of sponsors that reach out to us is basically to respectfully decline their invitation, because we're looking for sponsors all the time in the same way that you guys are looking for a best friend. And I may have even mentioned that on our other conversations. I say all the time, because just like you guys, you got your best friend, and it'd be great if you found a new one, but the likelihood of that is very low. I've worked in this business almost 10 years, and we have 6 sponsors that we feel like we're going to be working with them, for the next 80. And I'll probably spend the next 10 years trying to find 4 more. And there'll probably be some attrition, some sponsors retiring, working out, their key principals getting removed or moving. And it's always a matter of, if I can find 10 firms that I want to joint venture with, I will be a happy investor. If I can have 10% of my portfolio invested in 10 great sponsors that I want to work with for the next 60 years, that's how I want my portfolio allocated. It's not a pray and spray strategy. So word of mouth, extensive due diligence, hundreds of hours of due diligence, flying around the country, looking at different properties, asking hundreds of questions, many times asking the same question over and over again before those relationships are solidified, and then investing personally, proving a proof of concept, and then investing through our firm. It's really, really challenging to do, and pretty much no one makes it through that point, which is why we only have 6 sponsors that we work with.
And really quick, and if you don't have this, I apologize, but do you have a link or an article or a podcast that someone can listen to that maybe has more detail on that specific subject?
Yeah, so here's a little insight for people that are thinking about raising money. Pretty much anything that you ask about real estate, I have a link for, right? It's because I've done so much to ensure that I can answer that question honestly. I'll give you an example. I did a interview called 7 Stages of Due Diligence on Joe Fairless's show. And if you just Google my name and Google that phrase, you'll find it very quickly, and I'll give it to you as well so you can link it directly.
Fantastic. Appreciate it. All right. Perfect.
I have one more quick question for you, Hunter.
Sure.
Your fund structure, are you guys doing a Reg D 506C, or are you doing something different?
Yeah, 506C. So just for the listeners that aren't familiar, in the world of private securities, private real estate, there's basically 2 very popular exemptions from registration in terms of exemptions from going public. One is 506B, which allows 35 sophisticated non-accredited investors, but the drawback is you cannot publicly talk about your deal and publicly solicit investors. 506C, you are allowed to publicly solicit investors. For example, we have a fund that's available. That would be an example. And go here to learn more.
Yeah, and you can put a Facebook ad out there with a
Yes.
506C, and people can learn more.
Exactly. The drawback with that one is that They all have to be accredited investors, and they have to go through a process of third-party verification. Typically what that means is that their CPA has to sign a document saying that they are in fact accredited. Right. So we have ways to automate all that. It's a little bit burdensome, but once the systems are in place, I'm a big proponent of the 506C offering because I don't want to be in a gray area. I want to be able to act within the lines of the SEC's guidelines, and the solicitation of investors stuff is kind of gray.
Yeah. Okay.
Number 5?
Yes.
Let's do it.
So number 5 is about the close. And I think when people think about raising money, this is actually what they think about. They think about trying to figure out rebuttals so that they can ensure that no matter what happens, if they get on a phone call, they're going to get the close. And you guys have all seen the sales movies, ABC, always be closing. That is like the opposite of what my perspective on this topic is for a lot of reasons. When it comes to real estate, these are illiquid investments. These are with investors that want to defer to your expertise. But if something goes wrong, you're going to have to deal with that from a relationship standpoint. They're trusting you. So rather than ABC, I talk about my book, ABD, always be disclosing. I want to make clear all of the reasons why this can go wrong, why it's important that we vet our investors. And if they're interested in investing, that's absolutely great. That also aligns well with this whole idea that, I have what people want, and it puts you in a good mental perspective. So I actually just did a video called Closing Strategies for High Net Worth Clients. And it's like one of my favorite things that I've ever done. I just dissect that initial call because it's so important. I'll just leave your investors with this. If you can establish credibility within the first 5 seconds of the call goes much more smoothly. So there's a couple of ways that I do this. Number 1, establish the start and the end time of the call within the first 5 seconds. And also outline the agenda for the call. Just those 2 strategies. If you've got nothing else from this particular interview, just if you can say, hi, this is Hunter with Asym Capital. How are you? Or sorry, hi, this is Hunter with Asym Capital. Is Jonathan there? Yes. Okay, great. Excellent. So I've got us blocked from 2 to 2:30. I'd like to start with learning a little bit about you, and I'd be happy to share my story and our background, how we're positioned as the company, and then answer any questions you have. Sound good? Great.
Great.
Just
I love it.
Yeah. It just shows, number 1, you're not going to be drawn into some endless pitch. Number 2, I have another call at 2:30 that's going to be exactly like this one. If you decide not to invest, don't worry, we're going to get the deal funded. And I've been through this so many times that I found it's best for me to outline the structure so that we don't meander and waste each other's time. Just really powerful. And everything else, the people will go, okay, I can relax and just let this call run its course. You can basically be yourself from that point forward.
You kind of take the charge off of it, you
have to.
Yeah.
Oh, one other tip I'd say just on the topic, especially if you're dealing with really sophisticated investors, CPAs, accountants, private equity guys, people that went to Wharton Business School, sometimes they will want to assert themselves as being knowledgeable and jump right into the details of a particular deal. And as an example, you may say, hey, all right, Hunter, I reviewed your workforce housing deal and I really like it, but I'm worried about the debt service coverage ratio in year 2. It jumps down and I'm kind of concerned about when the deal starts to amortize that it's not going to be able to pay for itself. Something like that. Something hopefully no one would ever say to me in particular. I'm super cautious about debt service, which is why I bring it up. But let's say they did jump into that. My response is not, well, the 1.3 debt service coverage ratio is this, that, and the other thing, and we believe it's conservative because no, that's just a analytic database thing that no one is investing with me based on the difference between a 1.4 and a 1.3 debt service coverage ratio. That's a mistake. To prove that you actually know what you're doing, you need to make it clear that it doesn't matter what the debt service coverage ratio is almost at all. What matters is that it's a good personality fit, that you know that you can trust this investor to be the type of investor that we can build a long-term relationship with, and that they know that they're entrusting you their $100,000, and that when things get challenging, you're going to do the right thing. And that's what that introductory call is all about. It's not about analytics. You're never going to win a deal over analytics. You're always going to win a deal over development of that personal relationship. So that's my suggestion.
Fantastic.
That's gold right there. Could not agree. So really quick before we wrap up, can you just, again, recap just on the top 5 points you think one should focus on when raising capital in real estate?
Sure. Number one, don't believe the myth. Don't believe the myth that the money's going to appear. It's way harder to do. And by the way, hey, listen, if it is true and I'm wrong, fine. You're well prepared, right? Great. There's no downside for not believing the myth. Number two, always remember that as much as we like to think about it, you're not the center of the circle. It's the funnel. The top of the funnel is filled with people that are interested. The bottom of the funnel is people that are invested. It's about attracting people to the top of the funnel, moving them through this process in a streamlined manner so that you can get the capital across the deal once they are educated. Number three is the nurture process. That's the newsletters, that's the podcast interviews, that's the in-person events or dinners or meetings, etc. Number four is the educate process, particularly when it comes to educating investors on your particular deal. Create something that you can use over and over again. I'm a huge advocate of webinars. And number five, the close. Don't make the mistake of focusing on things like rebuttals. What you need to do is be an absolute one-of-a-kind, no one is on this guy's level expert in this niche. And guess what? That's not what most people want to hear. This is not a matter of listening to this podcast and being an expert. We're talking about you are competing for money, especially you are competing against people and industries and institutions that have marketing budgets, the likes of which no one can even fathom. You have to beat out the guys that control E-Trade. You have to beat out the guys that control Scottrade. You have to make such a compelling case that you know so much about this particular asset that no one is even on your level. And once that's true, the money will appear. It's just that that's a lot harder to do than most people think.
Fantastic point. And there's just one more area I'd like to cover, and we'll wrap this thing up. But as somebody is wanting to jump into this arena, can you talk about attracting a mentor, working with a mentor, the importance of that, and what you would recommend for somebody who's looking for a coach?
Yeah, so I think that you did mention the attraction, right? And that's the whole thing with this. If you have the ability to identify someone who's best in class, someone who you feel from a gut perspective sees the world eye to eye, someone that you feel could be a partner 10 years down the road, and then inspire them to straight up give you the playbook, it's one of the most lucrative skills you can develop as a person, not just as a real estate investor. And so in my book, which is Raising Capital for Real Estate, I don't even know if I mentioned that already. I have a book. There it is. Raising Capital for Real Estate. You can get it at raisingcapitalforrealestate.com for free. It's like $8 and you pay for shipping.
Wonderful.
I talk about that in the book, which is that ways to identify those mentors and then ways to inspire them. kryptonite to this process is momentum. You know, my pitch to anybody that I'm trying to get really great information from is this. Number one, I've devoured all your free content and I figured out that we've got these three things in common that probably no one has picked up on unless they've really, really dove into the things that you've put out. And I've reached the ceiling on what that free content has created. Now, with that free content, you've given the ability to go 150 miles an hour. I'm going that direction as fast as possible. Now, my question to you is, do you want to come on board and go 160 miles an hour with me because of your help? Or are you going to let this opportunity pass by? As a person that has been both mentored and has provided guidance for others, that is, oh my gosh, it feels so good. And, you know, a great example of that is you guys, right? You reached out to me. You said, look, I loved your book. I read it once. We're reading it twice. How can I possibly say no?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, no matter how many times I received that email, which I love hearing that, that specific quote, I've read your book once and I'm going through it a second time. I know why you guys said that. And it's because that's the reason that I wrote the book the way I wrote it. I did not write it to be the bestseller. I wrote it to revolutionize people's ability to raise capital. And what I mean by that, it's dense. It's got enough stories to be
There's nothing else like it. Well, there's a couple that have started to come out since you wrote it, but it was, you know, spearheaded that whole industry on paper.
Love hearing that. And that's because y'all are my people. So if someone comes to me and goes, look, here's the reasons that I know that we're of the same, cut from the same cloth. I'd love to help you grow your business and come and help grow mine as well. I'm doing that interview 10 times out of 10 or anything like that. Right. So that's the key. Just being able to identify those unique things, pull them aside at a conference, say, look, I know this really unique thing about you that I share and I'm heading this direction super fast. I'd love to be, able to, tell a story about you in my book that I'm writing in 10 years.
Yeah.
That's the whole dynamic. And
Love
I should mention,
love this interview.
Fired up. I'll give myself a quick shout out. I was mentored by someone who was, really cautious about, paid subscription services for educational products. And I'm totally sympathetic to that. In the wake of 2008, there were so many people that were burned paying $100,000 for house flipping courses taught by people that didn't flip houses. It's a very common story. It's very compelling.
Not $100,000, but
yeah.
Yeah.
It's very common. Pay the $50,000 and look, you flip one house, you paid for it, right? So I was cautious about that. But at the end of the day, I saw other programs out there that didn't provide the level of depth that I'm willing to provide. If you guys like the book, that's the way the whole program is developed, right? It's just like, holy crap, how am I going to get through this much content, right? That's the way it works. So anyway, I created a program. It's called the CFC Mentorship Program, cfcmentorshipprogram.com. It's so cool to see people invest in something and then just take off like rocket ships. It's become one of my favorite parts of my business. So anyway, thanks for asking.
We love it. We love it. The cfcmentorshipprogram.com or yeah?
That's right. cfcmentorshipprogram.com.
All right, perfect. We'll have that in the show notes also. And then your other website where people can learn more about you is Asym Capital.
Yeah. And thanks guys. I really appreciate you having me on.
All right.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hunter.
Thank you, Hunter.
Happy to do it.
All right.